In this lecture, you will learn about gender roles, the Second Great Awakening, the temperate society, and the abolitionist movement. The centerpiece of new ideas about gender relations held that husbands found their status and authority in the new world of work, leaving wives to tend to the home. Men increasingly work outside the home, bringing cash to the household, while women continue to engage in the time-consuming labor in the home. Housework was defined as women's performance of loving familial duties, and it was rendered invisible in an economy that evaluated work by how much cash it generated. Sermons, advice books, periodicals, and novels reinforced the idea that men and women inhabited separate spheres and had separate duties. For example, the book The Mother at Home was written to clearly illustrate the roles and duties of a mother raising her children. In fear and admonition of the Lord, the book continues to be published and distributed today. The following is an excerpt from the concluding chapter. She who was first in the transgression must yet be the principal earthly instrument in the restoration. There is no combination of causes so powerful in prompting the happiness or the misery of a race as the instructions of home. Because of the cultural dominance expressed by the upper and middle classes in the Northeast through books and periodicals, these notions of gender roles gained acceptance in the 1830s and beyond, but these ideas had limited applicability outside of middle and upper class white culture. The market economy's new expectations for men and women require fresh methods of training youth of both sexes. By the 1830s, both the North and the South created state-supported public school systems. The fact that taxpayers paid for the children's education created an incentive to seek an inexpensive teaching force. School districts began replacing male teachers with young females. Advanced education also expanded in the 1830s with the founding of at least 24 men colleges and several more female seminaries. Male youths leaving public school face two paths: continued education, or more often, trade apprenticeships or entry-level clerkships. Changing patterns in youth employment and training meant that large numbers of youngsters in the 1830s and beyond escaped the watchful eyes of their families. The Second Great Awakening appeared in 1801 in Kentucky in the form of revival meetings that lasted several weeks. By the 1810s and 1820s, camp meetings had spread to the Atlantic seaboard states. The gatherings attracted women and men hungry for a more immediate access to spiritual peace and not requiring years of soul-searching as the prior religions had done. Women more so than men were attracted to the evangelical movement, and from 1800 to 1820, church membership doubled in the United States. The leader exemplar of the Second Great Awakening was a lawyer turned minister named Charles Grandison Finney, who directed his message primarily at men and women of the business classes. Finney argued that a reign of Christian perfection loomed, one that would require public spirited outreach to the less than perfect to foster their salvation. Inspired by Charles Harrison Finney's faith in the perfectibility of human beings and heartened by the rapid pace of technological process, many Americans set about trying to make angels out of man. There were some notable differences between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening. For example, the First Great Awakening emphasized on Kabbalism and stressed the sinful nature of humans. It also argued the need of a direct action of God's grace to overcome obstacles. And it made the church a little less institutionalized, moving away from church hierarchy and trained clergy. The Second Great Awakening emphasized on the quest for perfection. It also emphasized people as free agents that control their own destinies. The argument that people should do good on earth through earthly institutions led to social activism. It will also give rise to Baptists and Methodists. Undeveloped Southern camp meetings became routine community events. And cultural conservatism came to dominate the region. The Second Great Awakening also became an ideal for spiritual self-improvement. Self-control, piety, and self-restraint became aspirational goals. This fits with the free labor ideology, a vision of individual human potential. The idea was that anyone could climb the ladder of success. The evangelical disposition, a combination of faith, energy, self-discipline, and righteousness, animated vigorous campaigns to eliminate alcohol abuse and eradicate sexual sin. Organized opposition to drinking first surfaced in the 1810s. In 1826, Leon Beecher founded the American Temperance Society, which held that drinking led to poverty, idleness, crime, and family violence. In 1836, leaders of the temperance movement regrouped into a new society, the American Temperance Union, and demanded total abstinence from its followers. By 1845, alcohol consumption had disseminated to 1/4 of the per capita consumption of 1830. The intensified war against alcohol moved beyond individual moral persuasion and into a realm of politics. More controversial than the temperance movement was the social movement called moral reform, which aimed first at public morals in general, but quickly narrowed to a campaign to eradicate sexual sin, especially prostitution. In 1833, a group of Finneyite women started the New York Female Moral Reform Society, insisting that uncontrolled male sexual expression threatened society in general and women in particular. These women did not see themselves as radicals. They were simply pursuing the logic of a gender system that defined home protection and morality as women's special sphere. The idea of reforming society and cleansing all sin will also lead to the need to eradicate slavery. Around 1830, Norton challenges to slavery surfaced with increasing frequency and resolved, beginning in the free black communities with condemnations of racism. As their efforts to eradicate slavery intensified, this group became known as abolitionists. Their activism would lead to their own publications and media to disseminate their anti-slavery ideology. The Liberated newspaper was founded in 1831 in Boston by William Lloyd Garrison. Garrison took anti-slavery agitation to new heights by advocating for the immediate abolition of all slaves, without compensation to their owners. This article, first published on The Liberator, showcases Garrison's views. The article reads, asserting to the self-evident truth maintained in the American Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, I shall strenuously contend for the immediate enfranchisement of our slave population. I am aware that many object to the severity of my language, but is there not cause for severity? I will be as harsh as truth and as uncompromising as justice. Tell a man whose house is on fire to give a moderate alarm. Tell him to moderately rescue his wife from the hands of the ravager. Tell the mother to gradually extricate her babe from the fire into which it has fallen. But urge me not to use moderation in a cause like the present. I am in earnest. I will not equivocate. I will not excuse. I will not retreat a single inch, and I will be heard. In 1832, Garrison's supporters started the New England Anti-Slavery Society, and in 1833, anti-slavery groups were organized in Philadelphia and New York. This illustration is from a popular 19th century publication. It shows reformer Wendell Phillips addressing a meeting to protest the case of Thomas Sims, a fugitive slave being tried in Boston. A fiery and persuasive orator, Phillips was a member of the Boston Committee of Vigilance that tried to prevent Sims from being returned to slavery. The attempts made by Phillips failed on April 13. United States Marshals marched Sims to a ship that returned him to Savannah, where he was publicly whipped. Aside from creating their own publications, abolitionists will also become increasingly political. The Anti-Slavery Society was perhaps one of the most active abolitionist organizations of the time. By reading the Anti-Slavery Society's Declaration of Sentiments, it is easy to understand their anti-slavery argument. In the document, the Anti-Slavery Society states the following: that every American citizen who detains a human being in involuntary bondage as his property is, according to Scripture, a man-stealer. That the slaves ought instantly to be set free and brought under the protection of the law. That all those laws which are now in force admitting the right of slavery are therefore before God utterly null and void, being an audacious usurpation of the divine prerogative, a daring infringement on the law of nature, a vast overthrow of the very foundations of the social compact, a complete extension of all the relations, endearments, and obligations of mankind, and a presumptuous transgression of all the holy commandments, and that therefore they ought instantly to be abrogated. Women play a prominent role in the abolition movement, just as they did in moral reform and evangelical religion. However, as more women began to join the abolition cause, they also began to wonder about their own rights. Women like Sarah and Angelina Grimp will be boisterous in their demands for equality. Sarah and Angelina will create their own publications demanding equality, including the revolutionary book Letters on the Equality of the Sexes, published in 1838. Through their involvement in movements such as the temperance movement and the abolitionist movement, women will become organized. In 1848, in Seneca Falls, New York, they will put together the first convention dedicated to equal treatment of women. Some 300 women, including 40 men, attended the meeting at the Red Brick Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. After a series of brief speeches by others, Elizabeth Cady Stanton read a bold statement of purpose. Her statement came to be known as the Seneca Falls Declaration of Sentiments. The document adopted the style of Declaration of Independence and demanded equal rights for women, including the right for franchise. Her statement read in part, "We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men and women are created equal." It also listed a series of injuries that women had suffered at the hands of men. It concluded by accusing men of endeavoring to destroy a woman's confidence in her own powers, to lessen her self-respect, and to make her willing to lead a dependent and adjacent life. There will also be many free African Americans and former slaves who will risk their lives and freedoms to become part of the abolitionist movement. Another prominent abolitionist was Frederick Douglass. Douglass was a former slave who had run away to the North. His experience as a slave gave him a different platform than individuals like Garrison, who had never experienced slavery. Douglass was able to share his experience under bondage with the world and expose the brutality of slavery. Douglass initially worked with Garrison on The Liberator. But after a while, Douglass started to question Garrison's views that violent resistance to slavery was wrong, believing that slaves had a right to gain their freedom by any means possible. He also disagreed with Garrison that the U.S. Constitution was a pro-slavery document. Douglass had already begun to seek abolition through the political process, which Garrison opposed. So as he began to distance himself from Garrison's views, Douglass would publish his own abolitionist newspaper, the North Star, which marked the beginning of his independence from Garrison. Douglas' speech, What to the Slave is the 4th of July, delivered in 1852, showcases Douglas' eloquence and brilliance to show how the institution of slavery was hypocritical and against the core values of our country. Fellow citizens, pardon me, allow me to ask, why am I called upon to speak here today? What have I, or those I represent, to do with your national independence? Are the great principles of political freedom and of natural justice embodied in that Declaration of Independence extended to us? And I am therefore called upon to bring our humble offering to the national altar and to confess the benefits and express devout gratitude for the blessings resulting from your independence to us. The blessings in which you this day rejoice are not enjoy in common. The rich inheritance of justice, liberty, prosperity, and independence bequeathed by your fathers is shared by you, not by me. The sunlight that brought life and healing to you has brought stripes and death to me. This 4th of July is yours, not mine. You may rejoice, I must mourn. To drag a man in feathers into the grand illuminated temple of liberty, and to call upon him to join you in joyous anthems, where in human mockery and sacrilegious irony do you mean, citizens, to mock me by asking me to speak today? If so, there is a parallel to your conduct. David Walker will be another boisterous abolitionist. David Walker was a free black originally from the South with literacy skills, passionate convictions about freedom, wide knowledge of literature, and a strong religious consciousness. Walker often denounced Christian slaveholders' hypocrisy and advocated slave uprisings. David Walker's appeal to the colored citizens of the world was arguably the most radical of all anti-slavery documents and caused a great stir when it was published in September of 1829, with his call for slaves to revolt against their masters. In it, David wrote, "Are we men? I ask you, my Britain, are we men? Did our Creator make us to be slaves to dust and ashes like ourselves? They want us to be their slaves and think nothing of murdering us. Therefore, if there is an attempt made by us, killed or be killed, and believe this, that it is no more harm for you to kill a man who is trying to kill you than it is for you to take a drink of water when thirsty." The goal of the appeal was to instill pride in its black readers and give hope that change will come someday. Walker owned a second-hand clothing store on the Boston waterfront. Through this business, he could purchase clothes taken from sailors and barter for drink, and then resell them to seamen about to embark. In the copious pockets of these garments, Walker concealed copies of his appeal, which he reasoned would reach Southern ports and pass through the hands of other used clothes dealers who would know what to do with them. He also used sympathetic black seamen to distribute pamphlets directly. When the smuggled pamphlets began to appear in the South, the states reacted with legislation prohibiting circulation of abolitionist literature and forbidding slaves to learn to read and write. Warned that his life was in danger, Walker refused to leave to Canada. His body was found soon afterward near his shop, and many believed he had been poisoned. Another prominent abolitionist was Sojourner Truth. Truth was a former slave, and once she ran away to the north, she became very active in the abolitionist movement. In 1851, Truth attended the Ohio Women's Rights Convention, where she delivered her most famous speech, "Ain't I a Woman?", a slogan she adopted from one of the most famous abolitionist images, that of a kneeling female slave with the caption, "Am I not a woman and a sister?" That man over there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. Ain't I a woman? Look at me. Look at my arm. I have plotted and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could heed me. Ain't I a woman? I could work as much and eat as much as man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. Ain't I a woman? I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery, and when I cry out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. Ain't I a woman? Then that little man in black there, he says women can have as much rights as men, 'cause Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ came from? Where did your Christ came from? From God and a woman. Man had nothing to do with him. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down, all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. And now they is asking to do it. The man better let them. Her speech was a cry for women's rights, and it also showcased the hypocrisy of slavery. How despite all the talks that women could not do anything, when it pertains to slave women, they were stripped of their womanhood by ignoring all these claims of what women should or should not do, for which, she argued, slave women were women too. Despite the creation of these groups, however, many white Northerners were not prepared to embrace immediate or gradual emancipation. Although they might have opposed the institution of slavery, most remained anti-black and therefore anti-abolition. As the abolitionist movement grew, so did the efforts to try to stop them. In fact, most abolitionists will receive constant death threats, and some will die for their efforts to try to end slavery. One example is Elijah Lovejoy. Elijah P. Lovejoy will become the abolitionist movement's first martyr when he is murdered by a pro-slavery mob in Alton, Illinois, across from slave-holding St. Louis, as a mob tried to destroy his press and abolitionist materials. E.W. Taylor was a vocal anti-abolitionist. This document shows his views. And men like the abolitionist who goes about meddling with other people's affairs should pay attention to his own affairs and let his neighbor alone, as long as those professed to be Christians are, by their influence in gold, are producing discord and discontent and rebellion. Insurrection and division, emancipation will never take place. If these matters are going to be agitated, it will lead to the separation of the Union. I feel as though I could plunge the dagger to the heart almost of a brother in such a glorious cause. It will be for liberty, liberty. The anti-abolitionist movement will initially be successful in trying to silence the abolitionists with the implementation of a gag rule. The gag rule of 1836 prohibited the entry of abolitionist petitions into the public record. Moreover, when President Van Buren takes office, he reached out for pro-Southern sympathizers. During his presidential campaign, he called abolitionists fanatics, dismissing the issue of abolition in Washington, D.C. as inexpedient, and promising repeatedly that if elected president, he would not allow any interference in Southern domestic institutions. Despite this opposition, the abolitionist movement will continue to grow. That is all for now. Please stay tuned to learn what happens next.